March 6, 1944. The air above Berlin trembled like metal under strain. At 28,000 feet, the horizon was a frozen ocean of light. Below, the clouds were streaked with black smoke from the morning's bombing runs. Inside that sky, the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines merged into a single, endless growl. It was the voice of the 56th Fighter Group. They had climbed to meet the Luftwaffe. Again. For a year, the Germans had held the upper hand in vertical combat. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs could always spiral up, stall fighting their way to safety, while the heavy American Thunderbolts gasped for lift. The P-47 was a bruiser, huge, armored, and brutally fast in a dive, but hopeless when the fight turned upward. Every pilot knew the feeling, watching a German silhouette pull into the sun, disappearing, untouchable. But that morning, something impossible happened. When the German fighters pulled into their usual escape climb, the Americans followed. The Thunderbolts did not stall, did not fade away. They stayed locked on. Black smoke curled from a Messerschmitt's tail as tracers walked up its fuselage. The pilot bailed out too late. Within minutes, 11 German aircraft were burning across the sky. Not one Thunderbolt was lost. At the debriefing that evening, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke said only one sentence that everyone remembered. "Gentlemen, we just rewrote the rules of this war." The truth of that transformation began not in the clouds, but in a factory workshop 9 months earlier, where engineers argued over the shape of air itself. Throughout 1943, the P-47's biggest enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe, it was physics. The Thunderbolt's massive R-2800 engine could deliver 2,000 horsepower, yet most of it went to waste when the aircraft tried to climb. Its narrow Curtiss electric propeller, built for high-speed cruise, sliced cleanly through the air but failed to grab it. At low speeds, the blades were like knives cutting water. Beautiful in form, useless in thrust. Pilots complained of engines screaming at full RPM while the aircraft clawed upward, barely gaining altitude. Reports piled up from England. German fighters escape by climbing. We cannot follow. At Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, Chief Engineer Alexander Kartveli spread those reports across his desk like a battlefield map. Each line was a death sentence written in technical terms. His problem was simple to describe and brutally hard to fix. Increase the propeller's bite without tearing the engine from its mounts. He knew the equation by heart. Diameter, pitch, blade area, rotational stress. Increase one, and you risk disaster with the others. A larger blade could twist under torque. A heavier hub could vibrate the entire airframe apart. Somewhere inside that balance lay the key to survival. Two rival companies took up the challenge. Curtiss-Wright, maker of the original propeller, and Hamilton Standard, master of hydraulic pitch control. Through the winter of 1943, while Europe froze in blackout, their engineers worked under fluorescent light, sketching new blade shapes on drafting paper yellowed by oil and coffee. Hamilton's team proposed something radical. A paddle-shaped blade. Instead of thin, knife-like edges, these were broad and almost rectangular, pushing air the way an oar pushes water. To traditional aerodynamicists, it looked crude, inelegant, even ugly. But in wind tunnel tests, the crude design generated astonishing lift at low airspeeds, trading only a fraction of top-end efficiency. Curtiss answered with its own version, maintaining the graceful elliptical outline but enlarging the root area and adding cuffs to smooth airflow into the hub. Both worked. Both turned wasted horsepower into climb. By April 1943, prototypes were ready. Test pilots took off from Republic Strip at dawn, engines roaring against the cold Long Island air. They returned, grinning. The Thunderbolt no longer felt heavy. It lunged upward. The decision that followed would change Europe's skies. Both propellers would go into mass production. Hamilton standards for new Thunderbolts. Curtis's for retrofit kits shipped across the Atlantic. June 1943. Production began. December. First shipments reached England. January 1944, the 56th. Fighter groups swapped every propeller on its line. From that point, the P-47 was not the same airplane. It climbed faster, held energy longer, and could now duel vertically with the Luftwaffe's best. A change so small it fit in a shipping crate had just rewritten aerial doctrine. Pilots learned new moves: the climbing spiral, the vertical scissors, energy fighting. And behind every maneuver there was a blade, wide, gleaming, bending the air into victory. That winter, when thunderbolts rose through the gray English dawn, the men in the control towers heard a deeper sound, a slower, heavier beat. The propellers were different now. The air vibrated differently. It was the sound of the American war machine learning how to breathe. Winter 1943. Across the northeastern United States, the snow fell heavy, muting the noise of war factories that never slept. In the hangars of Republic Aviation, the air smelled of oil, aluminum dust, and coffee gone cold. Engineers worked in thick coats, fingers numb over drafting tables. Outside, the sound of engines being tested shattered the frozen dawn. Every test mattered, because somewhere over Europe, men were dying for the lack of a better propeller. The problem was embarrassingly simple to describe and painfully complex to solve. The Thunderbolt's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could deliver 2,000 horsepower, but its propeller could not translate that raw force into lift at low speeds. At 350 miles per hour, the thin Curtiss blades cut the air perfectly. But when a pilot tried to climb, especially above 20,000 feet, the blades simply sliced through thin air, creating more noise than thrust. The aircraft lost energy fast, forcing pilots to break off the pursuit, while German fighters climbed away untouched. Every after-action report said the same thing. They pulled up, and we couldn't follow. It was a quiet death sentence repeated in dozens of debriefings. Alexander Kartveli read those lines over and over. To him, they were not just complaints. They were physics in human language. A blade too narrow, an angle too shallow, a pitch that favored cruising over climbing. But any change meant recalculating stress, torque, resonance, and vibration across an entire airframe. The propeller wasn't just a blade. It was a beating heart, and hearts could not be replaced without rewriting the anatomy of flight. At Curtiss-Wright's propeller division, the draftsmen had filled a long wall with sketches, some beautiful, some absurd. One resembled a flattened paddle. Another looked like a bat's wing. One engineer, exhausted, muttered, "We're building oars for the sky." The phrase stuck. The paddle blade nickname began as a joke, but in wind tunnel tests, the joke stopped being funny. At low air speeds, the broad-bladed prototype grabbed air like nothing before. Climb rates surged. The test stand recorded thrust curves that doubled those of the older design below 200 miles per hour. Engineers stared at the graph in disbelief. The crude, wide-bladed propeller worked. Hamilton Standard went further. Their engineers added hydraulic pitch control that adjusted blade angle continuously during flight, keeping the engine in its sweet spot of power no matter the climb rate or altitude. The Hamilton blade looked ungainly, almost primitive, but the data spoke louder than appearances. It converted every ounce of horsepower into upward force. Yet danger lurked behind the numbers. A heavier blade meant greater rotational inertia. The risk of vibration tearing the engine loose was real. Test benches rattled, bolts sheared. One prototype nearly tore itself apart during a static run at full RPM. But instead of retreating, the engineers adjusted balance weights, refined cuffs, reinforced hubs. Failure wasn't a reason to stop, it was a direction sign. By February, two competing designs stood ready: the Curtiss Electric C5422S and the Hamilton Standard Hydromatic. Both could lift the Thunderbolt like never before. The question was, which one could be built fast enough. Republic aviation didn't have the luxury of perfection. The bomber crews in Europe were bleeding daily. 8th Air Force wanted fighters that could escort deep into Germany, climb fast, and hold the line. The Mustang was still months away from full numbers. The Thunderbolt had to improve now, or die in service. So the Army Air Forces made a decision almost unheard of: approve both designs simultaneously. Curtiss would supply retrofit kits to Europe. Hamilton would equip new P-47D models from the production line. It was industrial pragmatism at its purest. Inside a single month, orders went out to machine shops across the East Coast. Aluminum billets became blades, blades became crates, crates became lifelines. Every blade passed through the hands of men who knew what it meant. Some had sons flying those very planes. They polished each surface until their reflection looked back at them. By June 1943, the first shipment left New York Harbor. Crated paddle blade assemblies, each weighing 650 pounds, were stacked in the hold of Liberty ships bound for Liverpool. The journey took 2 weeks through U-boat waters. Dock workers painted red warning stencils. Handle with care, aircraft propellers, urgent. The war moved fast, but the sea moved slower. In those long days crossing the Atlantic, every wave carried more than supplies. It carried an idea that the war could be won not by miracles, but by metal shaped slightly differently. When those crates reached England in December, the men of the 56th Fighter Group at Boxted gathered around them like children opening presents. The mechanics pried open the lids, staring at the new blades. They were wide, thick, and strange, ugly in a way that made pilots nervous. "These look like barn doors," one pilot said. Another smiled. "If they make us climb, I'll paint mine gold." Over the next few nights, the hangars buzzed with wrenches and laughter. Old narrow blades came off. New paddles went on. The air smelled of grease and promise. When dawn broke on January 4, 1944, the first squadron of paddle-blade Thunderbolts rolled out onto the icy runway. Engines started one by one, a rhythm like thunder building in slow motion. Lieutenant Colonel Zemke climbed into his cockpit, glanced at the massive blades in front of him, and muttered, "Let's see if you can dance." He pushed the throttle forward. The new propeller bit the air like a living thing. The heavy P-47 surged down the runway, lifting sooner, climbing faster. The horizon fell away beneath him. At 10,000 feet, Zemke leveled off, smiling. For the first time, the Thunderbolt wanted to climb. He keyed the radio. "Gentlemen, the beast just found its wings." January 1944. The air over England was gray, wet, and endless. Beneath that ceiling of clouds, the 56th Fighter Group prepared to take their new Thunderbolts into combat. They had flown the P-47 for a year and learned to respect its temper. Heavy, armored, a tank with wings. It dove like a stone and rolled like a battleship. But now, with the wide paddle blade propeller bolted to the nose, it felt different. Eager, alive, hungry for the sky. They called it the Claw. The moment the throttle opened, the aircraft no longer glided through the air, it dug into it. The propeller bit the wind so violently that pilots could feel the pull in their shoulders. The P-47 lifted faster, sharper, almost impatient to break free from the gray. Zemke, the group commander, was first to test its appetite for war. That morning, the mission was simple. Escort a formation of B-17 bombers across the channel, meet the Luftwaffe if they came, and come home alive. The formation climbed in silence through 10,000, then 15, then 20,000 feet. The new Thunderbolts didn't lag behind as before. They climbed in formation without that desperate, strained roar that used to echo across England. Zemke's voice came through the radio. "Looks like we finally got ourselves a set of lungs." Someone replied, laughing, About time, sir. The first enemy contacts appeared over the Dutch coast. Small black dots, growing, splitting, diving. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, the familiar hunters of 1943. Their tactic was always the same. Dive through the bomber formation, fire, then pull into a steep climb, trusting the Thunderbolts would stall and fall away. For months, it had worked flawlessly, but this time it didn't. When the German fighters pulled up through the clouds, the Thunderbolts followed. Engines thundered at full power, but the P-47s didn't fall back. They stayed. Pilots felt the pull of the new blades biting the thin air, the heavy aircraft rising with a steadiness that defied memory. One German pilot, looking over his shoulder, saw the silver shape still there, closing in. He rolled, too late. Tracers arced upward, caught him in the belly. A bloom of black smoke spun downward toward the North Sea. Across the radio, laughter mixed with disbelief. "They can't get away anymore," one pilot shouted. Another voice, cool, controlled, replied, "Stay with them. Climb and cut across their turns." It was the first time in months that the Thunderbolts were not victims of physics, but masters of it. In the debriefing later that day, Zemke spread maps and gun camera stills on the table. German fighters that used to vanish in vertical climbs now appeared frozen in the film frame, caught mid-turn, mid-stall. Zemke traced a line with his finger and said, "They're fighting like it's still 1943. We'll make them pay for that." He ordered immediate changes to training. The group would practice climbing spirals and vertical scissors, learning to convert speed into altitude and back again. "Don't chase them straight," he told his men. "Climb with them, make them waste energy, then drop on them when they stall. We own the high side now." Through January, the 56th trained like a new army. They rehearsed every angle of vertical combat. Pilots described it as learning to walk again after living in a crawl. They discovered the joy of retaining energy, of knowing that the next pull on the stick would not leave the aircraft gasping but surging higher. One night in the briefing room, Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski stood up and drew a spiral on the chalkboard. "This," he said, "is how we kill them now." He called it the climbing spiral. Enter at co-altitude. Pull gently, keep the throttle open, feel the climb build. The German will follow, thinking you'll stall first. You won't. Let him climb into thin air until his wings tremble. Then roll over, dive through his smoke, and pull the trigger. It was elegant, brutal, and simple. The kind of tactic that only worked because the machine finally could. February 1944. The Thunderbolts took their new doctrine into the sky. The mission, bomber escort over Brunswick and Hanover, a route lined with German airfields. The sky was thin ice blue, the air biting cold. At 24,000 feet, the bomber stream glittered like a slow river of silver fish. Then the call came. Enemy fighters inbound. The first wave of Bf-109s sliced through the bombers, climbed hard to escape, and met a sight none had ever seen. Thunderbolts rising with them, nose to tail. At the edge of stall speed, P-47s opened fire, their 850 caliber guns blazing, the air filled with sparks, metal, and falling wings. In the span of minutes, 11 German fighters were destroyed. Not a single Thunderbolt was lost. Not one bomber in the formation was shot down. When the surviving Germans landed, their commanders refused to believe the reports. "Impossible," they said. "The Thunderbolt cannot climb like that." But film from gun cameras told the truth. The same planes, the same pilots, but with new blades that had rewritten the physics of air combat. As word spread through the Luftwaffe, disbelief turned into confusion. Intelligence officers examined wreckage from a downed Thunderbolt near Rhine. The propeller caught their attention first. It was wide, brutal, almost square at the tips. They measured it, wrote notes, and shrugged. Likely improved for takeoff performance, one engineer concluded. They didn't yet realize that those barn doors had closed the only escape route the Luftwaffe had left. Back in England, Zemke sent a brief message to Republic Aviation. "Your paddles work. Send more." From that day on, the 56th Fighter Group no longer chased anyone. They hunted upward, into the sun, and above 28,000 feet, where the air was thin and every heartbeat felt like thunder, the roar of those paddle blade props became the sound of something new, the sound of balance tipping. February 20th, 1944. The dawn over England looked deceptively calm. Frost clung to the canopies and the airfield smelled of gasoline and burnt coffee. Pilots of the 56th Fighter Group stood beside their Thunderbolts, engines idling low, exhaust shimmering in the cold light. In briefing rooms across the country, maps of Germany were covered with red circles, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and assembly lines. The order from 8th Air Force was clear: destroy the Luftwaffe where it lives. They called it Big Week. It was to be the largest aerial offensive ever attempted. For 6 days, thousands of American bombers and fighters would strike deep into Germany's industrial heart. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to fight. What no one yet understood was that the very shape of the war in the air was about to change, not because of a new airplane, but because of a new propeller. At 08:10 hours, the Thunderbolts took off in waves. The air over East Anglia filled with the sound of hundreds of engines merging into one vast vibration. Crews on the ground looked up as contrails spiraled into the pale sky. "Looks like the whole damn world's taking off," one mechanic said quietly. At 22,000 feet they formed up with the bombers, a silver river stretching across the sky. Below, Germany waited. Over Brunswick, radar operators in German command posts watched the incoming dots on their scopes multiply. Fighters scrambled from airfields at Rhein, Oldenburg, and Hanover. 80 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbed into the freezing air. Their commanders gave the same order they had given 100 times before: attack through the bombers, then climb to safety. But that doctrine was already dead. When the first wave of German fighters dove through the formation, the sky erupted in chaos: tracers, contrails, explosions. B-17s tumbled in fire, their crews parachuting into the white void. As the Germans pulled into their escape climbs, the Thunderbolts came after them, faster than physics should have allowed. The paddle blade propellers bit the air like claws, converting engine roar into raw lift. At 25,000 feet, Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski locked onto a climbing FW-190. The German pilot banked sharply, expecting the heavy American fighter to stall. But the P-47 stayed with him, engine howling at full throttle. The gap closed. Gabreski squeezed the trigger. 8 50-caliber guns spoke at once, stitching fire into the Germans' wings. The FW-190 rolled over, trailing black smoke, and vanished into cloud. Over the radio came Gabreski's voice, calm and measured. "The barn doors work." Across the formation, similar stories unfolded. Lieutenant Walker Mahurin shot down 2 Messerschmitts in the same engagement. Lieutenant Schilling climbed through a dogfight so steep his altimeter spun backward, then dove on his target from above like a falling hammer. Each kill was proof that the Thunderbolt had shed its old skin. By the end of the day, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 11 victories with no losses. Other groups, the 4th, the 78th, the 353rd, reported similar success. The Luftwaffe lost more than 60 aircraft before noon. German controllers were overwhelmed. "They climb with us now," one pilot shouted into the radio before his signal cut off. In underground bunkers, Luftwaffe officers pored over reports with disbelief. They knew the Thunderbolt well. Big, fast in a dive, but poor in the vertical. Now, suddenly, it was everywhere. When wreckage from a downed P-47 reached a test facility at Rechlin, engineers examined the propeller closely. The new blades were wide, heavy, almost brutal. An American modification, they wrote, likely to improve takeoff power. They did not yet grasp the truth that the geometry of these blades had erased Germany's final aerial advantage. Big Week continued for 5 relentless days. From February 20th to 25th, over 3,800 bomber sorties and 3,600 fighter escorts tore across Germany's skies. The Luftwaffe launched more than 2,000 defensive sorties, throwing everything they had. But every time German pilots tried to escape upward, the paddle-blade Thunderbolts rose with them, climbing through the same thin air that used to protect the Reich. By the end of the operation, Germany had lost 355 fighters destroyed and another 100 damaged beyond repair. The Americans lost 28. The exchange rate was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe and irreversible. For the first time since 1939, Germany's fighter command could not replace its losses fast enough. Factories bombed during Big Week produced fewer aircraft each month. Fuel shortages grew. And for the first time, veteran pilots began to die faster than they could be replaced. When the Thunderbolts returned to England, their fuselages were streaked with oil and gun smoke. The pilots stepped out into the cold air, their faces pale and hollow from hours at altitude. Yet there was something in their eyes, relief mixed with disbelief. Zemke stood beside his P-47, wiping frost from his goggles. He said quietly, "We can meet them now, anywhere, anyway." A war correspondent asked him later what had made the difference. Zemke thought for a moment, then pointed to the huge propeller blades still spinning slowly in the wind. "That," he said, "and the men who built it. The numbers told one story. The sound told another." Over the coming weeks, as Big Week gave way to daily strikes deep into Germany, Allied airfields were filled with a new kind of noise. The low, rhythmic beat of paddle-blade Thunderbolts reverberated through hangars and down English valleys. It was deeper than before, heavier, like the heartbeat of a giant waking from sleep. For the Luftwaffe, that sound was the echo of inevitability. For the Americans, it was the proof that ingenuity could turn desperation into dominance. The sky had turned red, not because of blood alone, but because of fire, speed, and the roar of machines that had finally learned how to climb. By the end of February 1944, the airfields of Western Germany were graveyards of twisted aluminum. Burned wrecks of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs littered the grass. Mechanics worked in silence, salvaging what they could under the pale winter sun. The smell of fuel and scorched paint hung heavy in the air. Inside command bunkers, Luftwaffe officers studied maps covered in black ink, losses, replacements, sortie counts. None of the numbers made sense anymore. For years, their doctrine had been simple and effective. Strike fast, dive through bomber formations, then climb to safety. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were born for that kind of combat. They could outclimb almost anything. In 1943, this tactic had saved hundreds of German pilots, but in early 1944 it started to fail. Silently, without warning, without reason. Pilots returned shaken, confused, muttering the same words over and over. "The Thunderbolts can follow us now." At first, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration. Commanders assumed the Americans had introduced a new fighter. Some even speculated it was an early version of the P-51 disguised as a Thunderbolt. But the gun camera footage told another story. The silhouettes were unmistakable. P-47s, huge and round-nosed, climbing in pursuit like they never had before. When engineers at Rechlin examined wreckage from a newly captured P-47D-23, they measured the propeller blades carefully. Each one was wide, rectangular, almost crude compared to German designs. They noted the enlarged root cuffs, the reinforced hub, the hydraulic pitch system, yet their report concluded blandly. Improved takeoff and low-speed performance, limited tactical value. It was a fatal misunderstanding. Meanwhile, in the skies, German pilots were learning the truth the hard way. Major Klaus Mitusch of Jagdgeschwader 26 led a squadron of FW-190s over northern France on February 21st. They spotted Thunderbolts escorting bombers at 22,000 feet. Mitusch ordered the usual attack, a shallow dive through the formation, quick burst, then vertical climb to regroup. But this time, as he pulled back on the stick, 2 Thunderbolts followed him upward. He rolled left, expecting them to stall and drop away. They didn't. The wide-bladed P-47s kept climbing, closing in even as his engines strained for air. One burst from their .50 caliber guns shredded his wingman's tail. Another German pilot tried to roll out and was hit in the climb, his plane spiraling down in black smoke. Mitusch barely escaped. Back at base, his after-action report was short and bitter. The Americans now possess a Thunderbolt capable of vertical pursuit. Climb escape tactics no longer valid. He added one more line. If this continues, we will have no refuge. Those words spread quickly through the Luftwaffe. Commanders at Jagdgeschwader 26, 2, and 11 reported similar experiences. Veteran pilots who had once mocked the heavy Thunderbolt now feared it. Some began to question whether to engage at all. The Luftwaffe's tactical foundation, aggressive hit-and-climb fighting, was collapsing under the weight of a single American modification, Luftwaffe. Intelligence finally issued a notice to all fighter units. The American P-47 has been modified with a new propeller. It now demonstrates superior thrust at low speeds. Avoid vertical combat unless possessing a clear energy advantage. Disengage in level flight only. But doctrine is habit, and habit is harder to kill than men. For months, German pilots had survived by climbing. It was instinct, almost muscle memory. Under pressure, no one thought about new bulletins. They pulled up, and they died. At Boxted Airfield in England, the mood was the opposite. Pilots of the 56th Fighter Group could sense the change even before the statistics confirmed it. Enemy attacks were less coordinated, less confident. German formations broke apart faster. "They've lost the high ground," one pilot said. Another replied, "And they don't know what to do down here." In briefing rooms, Zemke's chalkboard diagrams evolved into combat doctrine. Every new Thunderbolt squadron arriving in England trained in vertical tactics. The climbing spiral, the energy dive, the rolling scissors. The paddle blade propellers gave them options they'd never had before. Speed became altitude, altitude became position, and position became life. Gabreski perfected the method. He would engage at co-altitude, pull up slightly, forcing the enemy to follow. The German pilot, confident from experience, would climb harder, expecting the Thunderbolt to stall. Instead, Gabreski would keep rising, steady and patient. When the German reached the edge of stall, his aircraft shuddered. In that instant, Gabreski rolled over, dove through the spiral, and fired. The enemy had no chance. Again and again, the same story repeated. By March, Gabreski's kills had doubled. Pilots in his squadron joked that the Germans must think he had a new engine. But Gabreski always corrected them. "Not the engine," he said, tapping the propeller's edge after landing. The blades. For the Luftwaffe, the transformation was psychological as much as physical. They had built their confidence on the belief that German engineering could outfly American brute force. The Thunderbolt's success shattered that illusion. Reports from field units spoke of confusion and despair. "The Americans improve faster than we can respond," one colonel wrote. "We identify a weakness, and within months it is gone." At high command, discussions turned grim. Messerschmitt's engineers had long known that wider blades could improve climb performance, but Germany's factories were stretched to breaking point. Retooling for a new propeller design meant halting production for weeks, something they could not afford. They needed numbers, not perfection. And so, even as American Thunderbolts evolved, German fighters remained the same. In less than 3 months, the balance of air combat over Europe had reversed. The Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots, but skill meant nothing when physics itself had turned against them. March 1944 arrived with the chill of inevitability. On the morning of the 6th, the 56th Fighter Group once again crossed into German airspace, this time over Berlin. At 28,000 feet, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. It should have been another stalemate. Instead, it became a slaughter. Thunderbolts followed Messerschmitts into climbs that once meant certain death. 11 German aircraft went down. No Thunderbolts were lost. Not a single bomber in the formation was touched. The Germans landed in disbelief. "They climb with us now," one pilot said to his commander. "They are not the same machines." He was right. They were not. The Thunderbolt had become something new, something born from steel, data, and the stubborn will to fix what seemed unfixable. That night, in a cold English briefing tent, Zemke looked at the names on the mission board. All returned. Not one empty seat. He exhaled slowly, then looked out at the dark runway where the paddle blade props glinted in the moonlight. War, he realized, was not only fought with bullets, it was fought with ideas, ones shaped by the hands of engineers who never saw the sky they changed. And far away, in German factories still producing yesterday's propellers, no one yet knew that the battle for the air had already been lost. March faded into April, and with it, the cold sky of Europe began to change color, not just from the seasons, but from the rhythm of war itself. What had once been a battlefield contested inch by inch now belonged to a single sound, the deep, pulsing roar of thousands of paddle-blade thunderbolts cutting through the clouds. It was no longer the thin, high whine of desperate climbs. It was the heartbeat of an empire in motion. At Boxted, Debden, and Halesworth, the ground trembled every morning as squadrons of P-47s lifted off, their propellers flashing like mirrors in the dawn. Mechanics stood in the slipstream, faces stung by grit, watching the heavy fighters rise into the pale sky until they became silver specks. The men had learned to tell by sound which aircraft carried the old narrow blades and which carried the new. The narrow-bladed planes screamed. The paddle-bladed ones growled. That low, steady rhythm was the music of dominance. The transformation was complete. Within 3 months, 6 of the 8 Thunderbolt groups in England had converted to the new propeller. The remaining 2 were next in line. Replacement kits arrived faster than they could be installed. Cargo ships unloaded crates at Liverpool labeled Aircraft Propeller Assembly, Handle with Care, and from there they traveled by train through the rain-soaked countryside to the air depots. Crews worked by lantern light, removing old hubs, fitting new hydraulic controls, tightening bolts until their hands blistered. By dawn, another row of Thunderbolts would stand ready, their broad blades gleaming like black wings. In combat, the difference was no longer measured in theory but in survival. Bomber crews who had once prayed for escort coverage now watched in wonder as Thunderbolts fought above them in perfect vertical spirals. One B-17 gunner later wrote, "They didn't fall away anymore. They climbed right up into the fight. You could see the Germans break off because the P-47s were on their tails all the way to the top." Each mission brought back more proof. Combat cameras showed enemy fighters trying their old maneuvers, stalling, spinning, dying. Reports flooded headquarters with a single repeated phrase, "Climb performance exceptional." The kill ratios told the rest of the story. In early 1944, American fighters averaged nearly 2 victories for every loss. By summer, it was more than 4. But numbers could not capture what the sound meant. When a formation of Thunderbolts passed overhead, farmers in the English countryside would pause their work. Children pointed at the sky. The air seemed to throb, low and heavy, shaking windows and hearts alike. "That's ours," someone would whisper. It was the same sound that German soldiers at the front would soon come to fear. The deep, rhythmic growl that meant the P-47s were coming for the roads, The rail lines, the convoys, and everything that still moved under the Reich's crumbling sky. In Berlin, the reports grew darker. Factories bombed during Big Week could not recover. Replacement aircraft rolled off assembly lines slower than before, and many never made it to the front. Pilots were rushed through training with only 40 flight hours. They were brave, but bravery was no longer enough. Against paddle-blade Thunderbolts, their chances were measured in minutes. Luftwaffe engineers proposed their own wide-blade designs, but the war economy was collapsing. Aluminum was scarce, fuel scarcer, and time the rarest of all. Retooling production lines would mean halting output for weeks. "We can't afford it," said one official, and so Germany kept building fighters for a war that had already moved beyond them. Meanwhile, in America, factories at Farmingdale and Evansville ran 24 hours a day. Women in kerchiefs operated milling machines, shaping aluminum into perfect symmetry. Inspectors checked each blade for cracks and balance, then stamped it with serial numbers before it was crated for shipment. A simple loop connected the entire continent, from draftsman's sketches to the hands of a pilot over Berlin. No ceremony marked it, no headlines praised it. But every time a Thunderbolt climbed and lived to fight again, that loop tightened. By May 1944, the strategic purpose of air superiority was clear. The Allies were preparing for the greatest invasion in history, and every rifle, every tank, every landing craft depended on one condition: that the skies above Normandy belonged to them. And so the Thunderbolts went hunting, day after day, sweeping over northern France in pairs and fours, attacking airfields, railways, trucks, anything that could move. The paddle blade propeller, designed for vertical power, now proved equally valuable at low altitude. Heavy, with bombs and rockets, the P-47s dove like hawks and still climbed away before German flak could reach them. Pilots described the sensation of acceleration as almost alive. "You feel it grab the air," one said. "It hauls you out of the valley like a hand pulling you from a fire." To the men on the ground, that sound meant safety. To the Germans, it meant doom approaching out of the sun. The same dull beat that once rose from English airfields now echoed over occupied France, bouncing off ruined villages and broken forests. The P-47 had become more than a fighter. It was the drumbeat of the invasion to come. At Boxted, Zemke watched his pilots return from another sweep. Their aircraft were streaked with mud and oil, their faces pale beneath oxygen marks, but they were alive. He looked at the rows of Thunderbolts taxiing in, propellers still spinning slowly, blades flashing like a signal in the evening light. The sound filled the air, a deep, rolling pulse that seemed to shake the very ground. It was not the noise of an engine anymore. It was the sound of a nation breathing confidence. In later years, historians would count the victories and the ratios, the production figures and tonnage destroyed. But those who were there remembered something simpler. They remembered that sound, the low thunder that meant the war was turning, that the sky finally belonged to them. As one mechanic wrote in his diary that spring, "We changed the blades changed the climb changed the war." By May 1944, the Thunderbolts had become a storm. Across England's eastern coast, their deep-throated engines rose before dawn, shaking the dew from hangar roofs. The airfields at Boxted, Debden, Halesworth, and Bodney no longer slept. Mechanics worked under floodlights, tightening bolts, checking ammunition belts, loading rockets beneath broad, mud-streaked wings. In the distance, the sea glittered faintly beneath the pale horizon. Somewhere beyond that water, France waited. Every pilot knew what was coming. They were not told the date, but they could feel it. The missions grew shorter, closer to the channel. The targets were bridges, trains, fuel depots, radar stations, each one a vein feeding the German armies in the west. Every day, the paddle-blade Thunderbolts cut those veins a little deeper. The Germans called it Jabojagd, the fighter-bomber's scourge. They cursed the Thunderbolt for its armor, its guns, its speed, but above all for its persistence. It would dive, strike, climb away, and return again before the echoes faded. The new propellers made this possible. With the wide blades gripping the air, a fully loaded P-47 could lift off carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets. In the old days, such a load would have made the plane sluggish, trapped at low altitude. Now, it climbed easily, rolling into formation beside its brothers, each engine hammering a rhythm that could be felt through the cockpit floor. Pilots joked that the paddle blade was the best wingman they ever had. It never quit, never faltered, never let them sink. On May 19, 1944, the 56th Fighter Group launched one of the largest fighter sweeps of the war. More than 60 Thunderbolts crossed the Channel, fanning out over northern France in pairs. Their orders: destroy everything that moves. At 5,000 feet, Captain Gabreski spotted a German supply train winding through a valley near Amiens. He rolled his P-47 into a dive, the air screaming against the canopy. At 400 meters, he released 2 bombs, then pulled up sharply, the paddle blades clawing the air. The explosions rippled beneath him, smoke curled up through the trees. "Those blades saved me," he said later. "With the old prop, I'd have been scrap on the tracks." Elsewhere, Lieutenant Walker Mahurin strafed a truck convoy along a narrow road. German gunners fired wildly, tracers lacing the air. Mahurin climbed through the flak, turned back, and dove again. His Thunderbolt seemed unstoppable, rising after every attack with a growl that shook the sky. "It feels like cheating," one pilot wrote in his journal. "We dive, we climb, we live." By sunset, more than 200 enemy vehicles had been destroyed. Not one Thunderbolt was lost. The Germans began to call them Thunder Cows, huge, relentless beasts that could not be killed. In occupied France, German soldiers learned to read the sky by sound. The deep, rhythmic pulse of paddle blades meant trouble. It was different from the sharper buzz of the Spitfire or the smooth whine of the Mustang. The P-47's engine carried a weight, a vibration that crawled into the bones. "You could feel them before you saw them," one German infantryman recalled. "The air thickened, then they came and everything vanished in fire." For Allied troops preparing to cross the Channel, that sound was comfort. It meant the Luftwaffe was gone. It meant the sky was theirs. The Thunderbolts had scoured northern France so thoroughly that by early June, German air units west of the Rhine could barely take off without being hunted down. At Luftwaffe headquarters, despair turned to resignation. Reports from surviving squadrons told the same story. Fuel shortages, engine failures, ambushes by American fighters appearing from above. "They wait for us where we used to escape," one pilot wrote. "We cannot climb away. The air itself belongs to them now." In the weeks before the invasion, the Thunderbolts became the hammer of preparation. Day after day, they struck rail lines, power stations, and communication hubs. At night, their pilots lay awake in the barracks, hearing the muffled roar of distant bombers heading east. The war had become a machine, each gear turning another, and the paddle blade propeller was one of its smallest, strongest cogs. Zemke walked the flight line every evening, his coat whipping in the cold wind. He ran a hand along the propeller of each Thunderbolt, checking for nicks, dents, cracks. "These blades are the wings within the wings," he told his crew chief. "Take care of them, and they'll bring our boys home." The men nodded, understanding more than his words. By late May, rumors of the invasion grew louder. Pilots whispered dates and code names, Overlord, Neptune, but no one knew for sure. What they did know was that their mission was changing. They were no longer just escorts or hunters, they were guardians of a coming army. Their job was to make sure no German plane could touch the beaches that would soon turn red with history. June 5, 1944. The final briefing at Boxted was short. The weather was rough, the sea angry, but the order was clear. Tomorrow, we fly cover for the invasion. Zemka looked at his men, every face drawn tight with anticipation. You know your targets, you know your machines, and you know what's coming. When those boats hit the sand, the sky belongs to us. Let's keep it that way. Outside, the rain began to fall again, pattering against the canvas tents. The Thunderbolts sat lined up in the dark, their paddle blades glistening with water, silent now, but coiled with potential. Far to the south, in ports across England, ships waited. Soldiers slept in bunks, unaware that their fate was tied to the rhythm of a blade that could climb through the thin air of France. When dawn came, it would not be quiet. It would begin with a sound, the low, steady thunder of P-47s rising over the channel. And with that sound, history would move forward. June 6, 1944. The morning began in silence, broken only by the whisper of wind over the English coast. Then came the hum, a low, growing vibration that rose until it filled the world. Thousands of engines roared to life, echoing off the hangars, shaking the ground beneath men who barely had time to feel fear. At Boxted, Zemka stood beside his Thunderbolt, breath turning white in the cold air as the sun began to lift behind a curtain of mist. Across the channel, history waited. The air smelled of oil and sea salt. Mechanics pulled away chocks, waved their pilots forward. Propellers spun, blades blurring into silver discs. The sound was like thunder rolling across the countryside, 1,000 paddle-blade thunderbolts waking in unison. Zemka climbed into his cockpit, buckled the harness, and looked out over the line of P-47s stretching toward the horizon. He touched the throttle and said quietly, "Let's bring them home." One by one, the Thunderbolts lifted into the gray sky, their broad wings heavy with bombs and rockets. Behind them, the coastline of England slipped away. Ahead lay the most dangerous day of the war. Below, the channel was alive with movement. Ships as far as the eye could see, a floating continent of steel and willpower. More than 5,000 vessels crossed that narrow stretch of water, carrying an army larger than any the world had ever seen. From 30,000 feet, the formation looked fragile, like a string of toy boats crawling toward a storm. But above them, the sky was guarded by the paddle-blade squadrons of the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Thousands of P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s circling like hawks over the fleet. The Luftwaffe never came, not in strength, not as it once had. When radar stations in France detected the invasion fleet, German controllers tried to scramble every fighter they could muster. But fuel shortages, broken runways, and shattered communications turned their efforts into chaos. The few aircraft that did take off found the sky already filled with Thunderbolts. At 600 hours, near Caen, a formation of FW-190s appeared, climbing through the haze to intercept Allied transports. They never reached them. A patrol of P-47s from the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups intercepted at 15,000 feet. The Germans tried to roll and climb. Old instincts, but the Thunderbolts matched them, move for move. One after another, the Focke-Wulfs stalled and fell, trails of black smoke marking their descent into the channel. By Euro 700, the air above the beaches belonged entirely to the Allies. On the ground below, the first wave of landing craft touched the sand at Utah and Omaha. The beaches erupted in fire. Smoke rose like curtains across the coastline. Pilots circling above could see the chaos unfold, the flashes of artillery, the silhouettes of men running through surf, the shadows of tanks crawling forward. Radio chatter filled the airwaves, calls for cover, for strikes, for salvation. Zemka's voice broke through the static. All groups stay overhead. Take down anything with a cross on its wings. Thunderbolts dove through the clouds, their paddle blades howling. They hit German artillery positions, strafed convoys trying to reach the beaches, bombed bridges over the Orne River. Each attack came from above and ended with the same impossible climb. The new propellers bit the heavy morning air, hauling the fighters back into the sky before flak could find them. To the soldiers on the beach, those climbs looked miraculous. They came down like meteors, one infantryman recalled. And then they were gone again, up through the smoke, faster than anything I'd ever seen. At midday, a small group of German fighters attempted one last counterattack over Gold Beach. They were met by a wall of Thunderbolts. Captain Gabreski led the intercept. He spotted a pair of FW-190s trying to dive through the smoke. He rolled in from above, throttle full, the roar of the R-2800 filling the cockpit. At 500 miles per hour, the airframe trembled, but the broad blades held steady, cutting through the wind like knives through silk. He fired once. The lead Focke-Wulf burst apart in flame. The second tried to climb. Gabreski followed. The German pilot must have thought he could still escape by going vertical. It was the old habit, the one that had worked a year ago. But this was not 1943 anymore. The Thunderbolt rose after him, steady and relentless. When the German's engine faltered, Gabreski fired again. The FW-190 vanished into a plume of smoke. "Not today," he said over the radio. By sunset, the Luftwaffe had managed fewer than 100 sorties over Normandy. Most were intercepted before they even reached the beaches. American and British fighters flew more than 8,000 missions that day. The ratio was not a contest. It was an ending. When the last Thunderbolts returned to England that night, the airfields were quiet except for the low ticking of cooling engines. The pilots climbed down, faces streaked with sweat and salt, uniforms soaked from the humidity of the cockpit. Zemke walked along the runway, listening. The sky still echoed faintly with the rumble of distant engines, like thunder rolling away over the sea. They had done their job. The Luftwaffe had failed to appear in any strength. The beaches held. The invasion had succeeded. In his logbook, Zemke wrote one line before turning in: "The paddles carried us through." In the days that followed, Thunderbolts patrolled endlessly over the new front. They flew low over hedgerows and fields, attacking convoys, trains, and anything that moved. Their broad blades still bore the mud of Normandy and the dust of France. They were no longer just fighters. They were guardians of an army on the march. To the men below, their sound became as familiar as the heartbeat of the earth. When the deep, steady growl passed overhead, soldiers would look up, smile faintly, and whisper, "Ours." No monument marks that sound. No medal carries its name. But it was the sound that made D-Day possible. The steady, patient thunder of an aircraft that had learned to climb when it mattered most. The paddle blade had done more than change a machine. It had given wings to history. Summer 1944. France was burning, and the Thunderbolts ruled the sky. From Normandy's beaches to the fields of the Loire Valley, the sound of the paddle blade propeller had become the rhythm of conquest. Low, heavy, and unstoppable. Every morning, before the mist lifted from the hedgerows, engines began to rumble across dozens of airstrips hastily built behind the advancing Allied lines. Mechanics worked sleepless nights under dim lamps, patching bullet holes and fitting new bomb racks. The smell of hot oil mixed with wet grass and cordite. When the first light touched the treetops, the Thunderbolts rose again. Their wings carried the scars of D-Day, their bellies packed with rockets, bombs, and fuel. The same paddle blade propellers that had once lifted them above German fighters now hauled them into low, brutal missions, hunting the arteries of the Reich itself. Roads, bridges, trains, convoys. Nothing moved without fear of the silver predators above. They called it Thunderbolt weather. Blue skies, light winds, and no mercy. July 1944. The 56th, 78th, and 353rd Fighter Groups flew more than 100 sorties a day, striking deep into occupied France. Each mission began the same way. The pilots would line up on rough grass runways, throttle up, and feel the propellers grab the air like fists. The aircraft leapt forward, heavy but eager. At treetop height, the blades cut through the morning mist, leaving swirling patterns of vapor in their wake. Their targets were simple: movement. Anything that moved. A column of trucks on a narrow road. A train crossing a viaduct. A fuel depot hidden behind trees. The Germans learned quickly to travel only at night, but the Thunderbolts learned faster. Dawn sweeps caught them on open roads, their vehicles still warm from midnight runs. Rockets hissed downward, followed by the staccato roar of 8 machine guns. Dust and smoke rose in plumes that could be seen for miles. Pilots returned home with blackened canopies and empty ammunition belts. Some spoke little after landing, others laughed too loudly. War had become a daily harvest. "We plow with fire," one pilot said, staring at the smoke drifting east. The paddle blade propellers turned this slaughter into efficiency. The heavy Thunderbolt, loaded with bombs and rockets, should have been clumsy. Yet the wide blades gripped the air even at low speeds, letting pilots pull up sharply after an attack instead of skimming the ground. "You can feel them bite," Lieutenant Schilling told a reporter. "You drop your load, pull, and the thing climbs like it's got claws in the wind." A small change in metal shape had made a monster of the machine. The Germans had no answer. The Luftwaffe was broken. In June, it had launched fewer than 100 sorties over Normandy. By August, it barely flew at all. Most remaining fighters were destroyed on the ground, caught in their dispersal fields by the very aircraft they once hunted. When German pilots did take off, they faced a sky filled with Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Tempests waiting like vultures above the clouds. One Luftwaffe ace, captured after bailing out, was asked what he thought of the new Thunderbolt. He hesitated, then said, "It climbs like a god and kills like a hammer." Through July and August, the war became a one-sided storm. Thunderbolts flew more than 80,000 sorties in 6 months, destroying trains, fuel dumps, and more than 3,000 enemy aircraft. They tore open supply lines feeding the German front in Normandy, isolating units faster than they could retreat. In one raid near Falaise, 40 Thunderbolts attacked a trapped German column. The valley erupted in explosions. Tanks burned, trucks detonated, and the smoke turned the daylight black. When the last Thunderbolt climbed away, the road was gone, just twisted steel and silence. Above the chaos, pilots could see the pattern from miles away. The once orderly German retreat had become a river of wreckage. "We weren't just fighting them," Zemke later said. "We were erasing their ability to move." By September, the front had pushed to the borders of Belgium. New forward airfields opened every week, carved from wheat fields and vineyards. Thunderbolts landed on dusty strips so rough the propeller tips sometimes struck pebbles. Yet the blades held. The mechanics, knowing how much depended on them, checked every bolt, every blade angle. "They're tougher than we are," one crew chief said, patting the broad metal arcs. Even as the Allies advanced, the missions never grew easier. German flak was everywhere. The pilots flew low, so low they could see faces in the gun pits. "Every run felt like flipping a coin," one recalled. "Heads you hit, tails you burn." But the propellers made survival possible. A Thunderbolt could pull away from the ground faster than any other fighter-bomber. When the cockpit filled with smoke and alarms screamed, the pilot would yank the stick, feel the blades bite, and the plane would claw its way skyward once more. Through the summer, the rhythm of war became mechanical. Climb, dive, destroy, return, repeat. At night, the airfields glowed with the orange of maintenance lamps. Engines cooled, propellers ticked quietly as metal contracted. Pilots sat on empty fuel drums, staring at the horizon where artillery flashes still pulsed. The smell of burnt oil clung to their uniforms. Zemke would walk the line, pausing beside each aircraft. The once sleek propellers were now chipped and pitted, their edges dulled by dust and debris. Yet they spun true. "They've earned their scars," he told a young mechanic. The mechanic nodded. "So have we." By August's end, the Allies had crossed the Seine. Paris was free. The Luftwaffe no longer dared challenge the sky in daylight, and the Thunderbolts, those heavy, loud, unstoppable machines, had become the very symbol of Allied power. Children in liberated towns pointed upward and shouted, "Les gros avions," the big airplanes. But for the men who flew them, the victories carried weight. They had seen too many black columns rising from the fields below. War had become arithmetic. Sorties, kills, fuel, losses. And yet, as Gabreski once said, every climb still feels like defiance. Every pull on the stick feels like choosing life over gravity. That summer, the paddle-blade Thunderbolt was everywhere, above bridges, above rivers, above retreating columns that would never reach the Rhine. Its growl rolled across Europe like distant thunder, echoing off mountains and cities alike. And wherever that sound was heard, the war beneath it was already lost. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were quiet, buried beneath snow and smoke. The war in Europe had seemed nearly won. Allied armies had crossed France, the Luftwaffe was broken, and the Thunderbolts, those broad-winged paddle-blade beasts, flew almost without opposition. Pilots talked of Christmas at home. Mechanics painted nose art with lazy confidence. The sky felt safe, but war never dies quietly. Before dawn on December 16th, the silence cracked. German artillery roared across the frozen front, shaking the ground for miles. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Out of the fog and trees came the armored ghosts of the Wehrmacht, striking west in one desperate counterattack. For days, the weather was too bad for flight. Thick clouds pressed low, rain turning to sleet, sleet to snow. The airfields along the front were grounded, engines stayed cold. The sky belonged to no one, and in that gray silence the Germans advanced. Zemke stood in the mess tent at Boxted, staring at the weather reports pinned to the wall. Each one told the same story. No visibility, ceiling under 500 feet, ice formation critical. He slammed his glove against the table. "They're moving under cover of our own damned sky." Outside, the wind hissed through hangar doors, carrying the distant rumble of artillery from across the channel. For a week, the P-47s waited, engines silent, pilots restless. Then, on December 23rd, the clouds broke. The sun rose like a blade cutting through mist. Across dozens of airfields, crews ran for their stations. "Warm them up," shouted a chief mechanic. The smell of fuel filled the air. Propellers turned, first slowly, then faster, until the familiar growl returned, the heartbeat of deliverance. When the Thunderbolts finally lifted off that morning, they were rising into history's last great storm. The Germans had pushed nearly 50 miles into Allied lines. Towns were burning, convoys trapped, skies still gray with smoke. As the Thunderbolts climbed through the lifting fog, the world below revealed itself. Columns of tanks threading through white forests, black smoke pouring from wrecked trucks, frozen rivers glinting beneath shattered bridges. At 10,000 feet, Zemke's radio crackled with voices. "Targets everywhere, sir, all heading west." He answered with 3 words, "Then stop them." The Thunderbolts dived. Their paddle-blade propellers screamed as the aircraft plunged from the clouds, heavy with bombs and rockets. The first explosions rolled across the valleys. Tanks burst like shells, cracked by fire. Trucks flipped, trees splintered. Then, almost as one, the Thunderbolts pulled up, engines straining, propellers biting deep into the cold air, dragging 7 tons of metal back into the sky. The German soldiers on the ground looked up through falling snow and saw them rise again, again and again, unstoppable. The same pattern repeated all day. Dive, strike, climb, return. The snowfields became black with craters. The Ardennes echoed with the rhythm of war's last heartbeat. For the next 2 weeks, the paddle-blade Thunderbolts flew without pause. Over 3,000 sorties, 6,000 tons of ordnance dropped, countless columns destroyed. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene, but its wings were gone. A few desperate German fighters appeared on Christmas Eve, new Mi-262 jets streaking through the clouds, but they were too few, too late. The Thunderbolts fought them anyway. One pilot, Lieutenant Joe Laughlin, described it later. They were faster, sure, but they couldn't climb with us at low speed. Nothing could anymore. The skies of the Ardennes became a furnace. By New Year's Day, the German offensive was broken. Roads clogged with wreckage, tanks frozen in the snow, soldiers surrendering by the thousands. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise faded. The Thunderbolts returned to their fields, landing one after another in the cold afternoon light. Mechanics greeted them in silence. The men had seen too much fire for celebration. By February 1945, the war in the air was effectively over. Germany was bleeding from every wound. The P-47s still flew, but now their missions were mercy and mop-up, striking rail lines, escorting bombers, and watching the crumbling of a nation. Pilots spoke less over the radio. Even Gabreski, the ace who had once drawn laughter in every debriefing, grew quiet. He knew the end was near. On April 30th, the news came through the static. Hitler was dead. Within days, the fighting stopped. The sky, for the first time in years, was empty. The war ended, but the machines that had carried it did not rest easily. Most of the Thunderbolts were retired, scrapped, or sold to foreign air forces. Their mighty R-2800 engines were dismantled, their broad blades stacked in crates like the wings of fallen giants. On quiet airfields, the hangars that had once shaken with thunder now echoed only with wind. Yet, for those who had heard it, the sound never left. In post-war interviews, veterans always spoke of the same moment. The climb. That instant when the heavy fighter, straining under its own weight, suddenly found lift. The hum deepened, the cockpit shook, and the earth fell away. That was the sound of survival, of something larger than technology, the proof that courage, steel, and human hands could bend the sky itself. Years later, Zemke was asked what he thought had won the air war over Europe. He didn't mention strategy or numbers or even the Mustang. He simply smiled and said, "A propeller that worked the way it was supposed to." He paused, then added softly, "And a country that knew how to make one fast." Because in the end, it was not one invention that won. It was the ability to change, to take what was failing and make it better before the war was lost. The paddle blade propeller was never meant to be famous. It was just an idea drawn on paper, hammered into shape by cold hands in warm factories. But it carried men higher, faster, farther than they had ever dreamed. It turned the P-47 from a lumbering brute into a predator that ruled the sky, and in doing so, it helped turn the tide of a world war. Spring came to Europe again. Fields turned green where craters once smoked. In museums now, a few Thunderbolts still stand, their wide blades frozen mid-spin. Dust gathers on the aluminum skin, sunlight glints off old insignia, and schoolchildren walk past without hearing the echo that still lives in the metal. But if you listen closely, really listen, you can almost hear it. The low, steady growl of a propeller biting into the wind. The hum of a world learning how to climb again.